Commissioner. We're one of the 5 or 6 biggest flight centers in Canada, and I'm also a director of the Air Transport Association of Canada from the flight training side of things, and in that have been spearheading a pilot shortage working group for the last year, looking at the various aspects of pilot shortage in particular, and secondly, we're starting to look into some of the AME issues as well. Introduce the panel. Dr. Suzanne Cairns is at the University of Waterloo. Teresa Davis Woodhouse is with the Canadian Council for Aviation and Aerospace. Andrew Money is the chief pilot at Chartwright, and Al is the director of human resources for Chartwright, and they'll be tag teaming together. So the labor shortage, the pilot shortage is the one that seems to be getting the most press. Equally, there are shortages in the maintenance side. The third thing is the imbalance between men and women in aviation in general, piloting in particular, but aviation in general. Less than 10% of pilots are female. And then mid-career changers, people who are in their late 30s, 40s, or 50s, who are either have the opportunity to change careers into aviation or back into aviation, or who are looking at semi-retirement or retirement before the traditional 65 age. Part of the issue that we've been dealing with in the ATAC project is barriers to entry. Financial support for pilots in particular is daunting. The kids are looking, or families are looking at a tab of between $70,000 and $100,000 just for the flight training. And if you combine that with a college or university diploma, you're well into the 6 figures for a 2 to 4 year program. And then the second part is awareness. Kids generally don't want to get into aviation. The opportunity to be exposed to it, to be excited by it, seem to be limited. So how can we start to look at that? The question for today is, how do we deal with that stuff in the context of business aviation? And then what does business aviation want to do to represent itself in the opportunity with the aviation sector, opportunities in the aviation sector that will make you better able to attract talent? On the pilot shortage, we can quibble about the numbers, but there is at least 400, perhaps as many as 500 or 600 person gap between the commercial pilot output of Canadian flight schools for Canadian students to the reported hiring requirements of the airlines that have been taking part in our working group. And they report that in 2018, they reported hiring about 1,300 entry-level pilots. Now, entry-level in the context of airlines, but and the output gap of new commercial licenses is 500 or 600. So there's at least that kind of a gap between supply and demand. CBAA just did a survey. So 38% of the members of you guys are not losing pilots, but 24% are, and they tend to be going to mainstream airlines, was what the survey identified. So there's probably some work to be done there in trying to clarify that and see what, how big your turnover issues are, where they're coming from, and where they're going to. What's that doing to your entry-level experience? And the traditional thing of flight hours being the benchmark for all hires seems to be changing dramatically, at least on the airline side. So pilots go for better pay, lifestyle, and advancement, and oftentimes those things are contradictory. I want to be home at night, but I want a lot of money, and I want to fly a big shiny airplane. So they don't all necessarily go together. So how do we, as employers, start try and reconcile some of those competing issues? Admission to flight schools is increasing, and that's only in the last 2 years. It's been flat for 10 years. And in fact, the number of commercial licenses over the 10-year period has tended to decline. That is, the licenses are slowly turning around, and the enrollment is showing signs of having significant increases, at least in our school in southwestern Ontario. Flight instructors, from my perspective, is the biggest challenge we have. This will be the third year in a row. So we have 35 flight instructors in our school. And for the third year in a row, we will be having about 50% turnover of those flight instructors. The average span with us has gone from 3 to 4 years to less than a year and a half. And they never get to the point where they are doing multi or IFR sort of training. They come in, and at 700 hours, they go off to Air Georgian, and at 1,500 hours, they can go wherever they want. So that's creating, we're sort of starving off the bottom end of the food chain here, and we need to figure out some ways as flight schools how we attract, retain good candidates and keep them long enough to grow into the more senior levels of training. And that leads to the whole career pathway program. So airlines have pathway programs. We're now starting to look at pathway programs to flight instruction and schools. And the Air Cadets are starting to look at how they can start to encourage their members to do that. So there's lots happening, but it's still a very convoluted set of issues. Maintenance, I've talked about, and scheduling and dispatch is something that came up in the survey that CBAA did as well. That for you guys turns out to be an issue that has not been identified so clearly on the airline operations. So that brings me to women. Waterloo Wellington Flight Center has been one of the champions of supporting organizations who promote women in aviation and who work hard to try and create opportunities for women. So there's some really good organizations across the country that are doing that. So the Canadian Women in Aviation does a conference every 2 years. 2019 is the next one. Northern Lights Aero Foundation celebrates with awards of excellence every year. They recognize 8 to 10 women who, from different aspects of aviation, for outstanding achievement. They have a gala banquet in end of September every year. The 99s has got some initiatives and scholarships that make funding available for women. And there's a newish organization called Elevate Aviation that's come out of Edmonton, spearheaded by a couple of NAV Canada gals to do activity. And they've received some funding from the Federal Status of Women Ministry to do some research and outreach activities. There's lots of schools and companies do lots of activities. Girls Can Fly, Girls Take Flight, Fly It Forward, that create opportunities for kids, young women, young girls to get into airplanes, little airplanes, and experience flight firsthand at an early age. And at Waterloo, we've done that now for 7 years, and we do between 200 and 300 rides a year in cooperation with the local Canadian Owners and Pilots Association chapter. So we had that in May. And I think it was 220 or 230 girls that got to go for rides. The barriers, there's a need for industry-led scholarships. I was delighted to see the scholarships that CBAA has that were awarded earlier today. We need to do more of that across the industry. I've suggested at ATAC that 5 cents a ticket would go a long way in a scholarship fund if the government matched that. That usually led to very, very, very stiff silence in the room. We need to do something about government loans and grants. The Canada Student Loans Program is a patchwork quilt across the country. In Alberta, kids can qualify for $65,000 to go in student loans to go to a private flight school. In Ontario, private flight schools are excluded from Canada-Ontario student loans. So it's not a level playing field. And then we're also looking at ways to transition into work and raising the entry-level work wages. Flight instructors traditionally made $17,000 a year. It's better than that now, but it was not exactly an attractive salary. Somebody that comes out of optometry from the University of Waterloo can get a job for $100K right out of school, and
pilots can do a little better than 17K, but we need to figure out how to make it sustainable that way. And then the awareness stuff, there's lots of activities going on, and the ATAC project is basically trying to provide a point of coalescence for what's where, and to help teachers, in particular Air Cadet leaders and that sort of thing, to know what's going on, what's available to them to help their kids be more aware of the opportunities in aviation. And then the bottom one, viable career paths. In preparing for this panel, we realized that we have not done anything on the business side at all. So hopefully out of this, you would say we should try and make the case for business aviation, at least have some aspects of business aviation included in the information that's going to be available on the website. Next steps, where do we go here? So this is the infomercial. This is the sort of banner, and there's a website that will go along with this that will be out sometime this summer. And there's some support materials that are under this ATAC project. National has published a flight training and scholarship guide in cooperation with the Canadian Aviator magazine out of Vancouver. And it's available. We have a few here, and there's overrun copies available. If that's something, if you have access to groups of kids or teachers or that sort of stuff, it's a good start. We need to build on that. Next year, hopefully, your business aviation stuff would be included in the list of scholarships. So COPA has actually stepped up to the plate in a very positive way. The guide is one thing, and the activity that they're sponsoring with their local chapters across the country. So there's probably some ways that you guys in your own airports could take part. Kids love to get into airplanes. At our COPA activity, the Porter brought an airplane, one of their Q400s, and there was a lineup all day of going in, talking to the pilots and that kind of stuff. So getting those opportunities that you're not barricaded in the back of the airplane with a bulletproof door between you and the pilots. The first speaker is Suzanne Cairns, and Suzanne is an aviation academic who researches and teaches on aspects of international aviation, human factors, safety management, training methodologies. She's past president of the University Aviation Association in the States, a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, and vice chair of the International Civil Aviation Organization ICAO's Next Generation of Aviation Professionals program. Suzanne is author of many articles and 4 books on Canadian aviation, and first published in 2009, E-Learning for Aviation, co-author of Competency-Based Education in Aviation, Exploring Alternative Pathways, published in 2016, and recently published a textbook on fundamentals of international aviation designed to support the next gen as they seek a career in aviation. Suzanne's presentation is on the role of competency-based education in supporting the next gen of aviation professionals, and explore the origin, purpose, and pitfalls of competency-based approach to aviation training. Dr. Suzanne Cairns.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to the CBAA for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you, and also to welcome you to Waterloo. This is actually local for us, so I hope you're enjoying yourself here so far. Okay, so I'm really here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the pilot supply issue from an international scale. So in the role that I have with ICAO's, they call it the NGAP program. It's the Next Generation of Aviation Professionals program. What we're really looking at is, from the global picture, what's happening with the supply of pilots and maintenance and people who work in airports and flight attendants and everybody in between. The reality is that the growth in aviation doesn't just affect pilots, it creates a bigger need for everybody. So these are some pictures that ICAO has produced, and if you look at this, this is a snapshot of global traffic in 2010, and that's 2040. So the projections, as you can see, are quite dramatic, and what I found really fascinating is that if you look at the numbers, so in 2015, you can see, you can read the numbers yourselves, but if you look at 2036, what you're actually seeing is a doubling of the industry. So you're seeing roughly twice as many passengers, increase in jobs, and significantly more economic activity. So all of these things are good for most cases in our industry because it means lots of opportunity for people who have businesses, and it's going to create more traffic and more jobs. But where it is really a challenge is where we're going to get the young people who are going to be coming in to fill a lot of those job openings and how we're going to accomplish that. I also like ICAO because they calculate what they call aviation center of gravity. So they look at the geographical center of departing and arriving passengers. And if you look at the first X from 1970, it gives you a pretty strong indication that North America was really a leading force in aviation, that we've historically had a lot of really solid aviation activity here. But if you look at where we are in 2014 and the projections for 2040, you can see that the center of gravity for aviation is moving eastward. So we're seeing tremendous growth in the Asian Pacific region. And what's challenging about that is that most of those states lack flight training capacity. So you've probably heard about Asian carriers having cadet programs and they send all their kids to Australia. I'm sure probably some of you have heard that. But what's interesting in that Canada, we actually have a really great infrastructure for flight education. We have lots of open airspace. I could tell you, one of my former students, he was from China and he went back to become a flight instructor. And he said that every day when he wanted to take his students flying, he'd have to pick up the phone and call the military and say, could I please go flying today? And he said most of the time they'd say no, and that he wouldn't be able to. So it gives you an indication that there's tremendous growth in that area, but also a lack of capacity. So what we're going to see is a sort of a vacuuming effect from areas where we traditionally produce a lot of people moving to other parts of the world. I had dinner last week with some of the executives from Singapore Airlines, and they're in a tremendous threat because in the China region, they're paying their pilots 3 times what Singapore Airlines is paying their captains tax-free. And so their threat is that their pilots are looking at their opportunities and basically saying, I could work 5 years and retire, or I could work maybe 20 more years here and retire. And all of a sudden that becomes a pretty significant draw for them to move. So these are also ICAO projections from an international scale, and you can see that these are just for pilots for 2016, and then the pilots for 2036. And so if you look at 2016 and you look at the Asia-Pacific line, and you compare that to North America, you can see that where we are today, we're pretty on par. Like you can see that the Asia-Pacific region is sort of similar to the number of pilots we have here in North America. But then if you jump and you look at what's going to happen or is projected to happen by 2036, then you see that significant growth that happens. So we're expecting growth here as well, but it's nothing compared to sort of the tripling that we're going to see in the Asian Pacific region. So that's going to impact everybody. And what should be shocking, you can't see it because there's a star. So if you look at the world pilots, it's like 619 and there's a star at the end. That star, you can't read it because it's at the bottom of the slide. Those projections are just for planes with more than 100 seats. So that should make everybody shake in their seats a little bit because we all know there are more planes and pilots in general aviation than there are in the airline sector. So we're seeing a tremendous need. That number, just to serve the airlines, equates to 67 pilots that need to be trained every day between now and 2036. What's also shocking about that is that 80% of those pilots have not even begun training yet. So we're seeing between retirements and the increased need that 80% of the pilots we're going to need for 2036 are school-age children. And so it really reinforces a lot of the activities of outreach and the importance of sort of getting the word out and also creating opportunities for young people to join our industry. Probably about 5 years ago at ICAO, a bunch of people started to recognize that the pilot supply issue is going to be growing to be a problem. And so a few universities and organizations, a lot of the alphabet soup people got together and created NGAP. And NGAP has escalated at ICAO over the past few years, so it's now a program, which means like it's an official thing. But what's interesting is that ICAO has their assembly meeting once every 3 years. Last year at the Assembly, this is where representatives from all 192 countries that take part in international aviation get together and they decide on really big, important things. At that Assembly meeting in 2016, they said that NGAP is a global priority, that the recruiting and teaching the next generation is something the whole world has to pay attention to. The challenge is there aren't really good solutions to it. So at the NGAP program, I kind of look at it as a 4-pronged approach with very different goals and strategies for each of those 4 prongs. So the first is attraction, And attraction is just about how do we reach out to these school-age children, understanding these are the professionals of the future. How do we make aviation attractive? How can we make it so that pilots aren't seen as glorified bus drivers, but we sort of regain the Top Gun feel from my youth? I'm sure there's more modern references that I'm not aware of. So how do we attract those people? How do we ignite that spark? And what I always say when I talk to my students, sort of I'm teaching my first class, and I say, share your spark experience. Like, share your experience you had that made you care about aviation. And everybody has a story, you know? Like, for my generation as well, a lot of us were invited up to the cockpit when we were traveling, when we were children, and the guy let us go in, and we saw what the pilots were doing, and that sort of ignited the spark for us. Of course, now that we have reinforced cockpit doors, that's not an opportunity that young people are getting. And so we almost have to recreate that. We have to think about how can we ignite the spark for young people. The next piece of that is recruitment, because it's not just enough for them to be passionate. I can tell you at the University of Waterloo, we're taking in 80 students this coming fall, all going to be pilots, but we probably get applications over 800 for those 80. Many of them self-select out because of the finances, that they just can't come up with an extra $100,000. And if everybody can think back to when you're 18 years old, it's not easy for everybody to come up with an extra $100,000 to pay for flight training. So recruiting is the next big challenge. So how do we teach people this is a viable career option, create pathways for them to come in? The education piece is about training efficiencies as well as licensing methodologies, and that's what the competency-based stuff I'm going to talk about next, so I'm going to skip over that. And the last piece is retention. So I think also all of us who are in aviation could probably name off a dozen or more people who maybe we went through training with and they didn't stay in the aviation industry for one reason or another. So they left to do something else. In sort of speaking as a woman, a lot of women choose to leave flying positions to take up other roles when they're having children and different things. So thinking about how our industry can incorporate flexibilities in order to retain the pilots that we have, because they're going to be needed. And supporting women, of course, is something, and I know my male students sometimes get irritated and they say, why is there so much focus on women? And what I say to them is regional airlines are at the point where they're canceling flights because they can't crew them. So encouraging women to come into aviation isn't taking your job, it's making sure you have a co-pilot or a captain to fly with, because we just really need people for the sustainability of the industry. So that's what ICAO NGAP program does. It's those 4 main goals, and sort of different people in the group focus on different aspects. So from an education perspective, I'm going to challenge you for a minute and ask you about hours. So I tend to get in good-spirited arguments online with people about hours, because our industry, of course, has a history of equating hours to expertise. So if I was going to ask you, and you can, as a show of hands, do you think that a higher hour pilot typically has better competencies than a lower hour pilot? I think it's fair you could say that's how our industry generally perceives hours, that hours equal experience. And that's very normal. And when I was writing my competency-based book, I interviewed a fellow from ICAO, and I asked him, I said, why hours? Like, what is it about hours? So we all kind of understand that not every hour is the same. Some hours can change your life, and some hours, my PhD student Adam was saying he's building hours. He said, you're just boring holes in the sky. Like, you're just trying to get those hours in for licensing requirements. So we all know that. We all know hours aren't all equal. So why do we use that for licensing? And he said to me, he said, well, think about it this way. Hours are easy. If you're a regulator and a recommendation comes across your desk for some sort of a safety issue and you need to do something, he said throwing a few hours of training at the problem gives the impression that you've done something. You know, you kind of check that box, when in reality, it may or may not actually solve the problem. And they're generally aware of this. So when you start to think about hours, I can share with you as well. So I went through Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Florida, and my roommate, her dad was a pilot with American, and he owned his own twin. So when we graduated and all the rest of us are kind of bumming around trying to figure out what we're going to do with our lives, she went home and flew her family's twin-engine aircraft in their local practice area until she had enough hours to apply for an airline job. It took her a year or so. And so if you think about only hours as a metric of skill and experience, I think it's quite clear that somebody who built 1,000 hours flying in a local practice area has very different knowledge, skills, and abilities from somebody who built those hours in multiple different companies, different operating environments, different weather challenges, and all sorts of things. Everybody kind of knows those two things aren't the same. So if you can kind of accept the idea that hours are the easiest way to measure expertise, but maybe not the best, then that can kind of open your mind to what competency-based training tries to do. So I always think about traditional hours building. So if you think about pilots traditionally finish training and they work as an instructor or they go in the bush and build hours, that I always kind of visualize it as like climbing a mountain. And if you're climbing a mountain, you have these switchbacks. You kind of go back and forth, and eventually you get to the top of the mountain, which I kind of visualize as achieving competence. And if you talk to those pilots and you can say, is every hour the same, or are some hours, they cause you to think critically and solve problems? And everybody kind of understands that there are some key moments in their experience that are really impactful. They're really challenging for them, and they had to think critically, and they solved it, and it caused them to gain experience, gain expertise. And then there were other hours where you're kind of sleeping, nothing's happening. And so what competence-based training tries to do is it goes to those pilots and it collects those important experiences. So what did you encounter that was challenging for you? And it distills those down into a training framework. And so the goal of competency-based training is kind of like a chairlift. So instead of causing people to happen upon situations that increase their skills, that in a training controlled environment, we expose them to those in a flight simulator, usually. And it's kind of like a chairlift directly to the top. That's the goal. So with competency, the end goal is the same. We want competent pilots who can effectively work in a professional role, but the path that they get is more direct, so it takes less time, but it's also very customized. So another challenge of sort of historical training is that if you've mastered something, but the regulations say you need to do it for 10 hours, you still have to do it for 10 hours, right? So even if you're weak in another area, you can't move on and focus on your unique challenges. You're stuck in this training framework, which may or may not suit what you actually need. So competencies is more personalized. So ICAO is establishing competency-based licensing frameworks. If any of you are aware of the multi-crew pilot license, or the MPL, which is what a lot of the Asian carriers use to get their trainees from no piloting experience into the right seat in 18 months. This is the sort of educational framework that's underneath it. And ICAO is going through creating competency frameworks for all of the aviation professions, not just for piloting. So if you think about competence, competence is what professionals actually do. So if you think about somebody who can act autonomously, so you don't need supervision anymore, you can act on your own, then you're considered to be competent. But competencies themselves are written descriptions of what professionals do. And this sort of three-tier definition, I think, can be really helpful in understanding what we're trying to do with competency-based training. But if I were to ask all of you to take a pen and a piece of paper, and I want you to write down all of the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes that you need to do your job, just think for a second how challenging that would be. It would take a really long time, and probably as soon as you put pen to paper, you're going to be losing some of the intricacies and complexities of what your job really is. Because a lot of our jobs are intuitive, like we do them without thinking about it. And so that's one of the real challenges of competency-based training, is these written competency statements are literally written by a group of experts sitting around a table and agreeing on what pilots need to know, what they need to do, and what their attitudes need to be in order to be a professional. So you can understand that there's a gap. That the competence you need to actually do your job versus the competencies that describe it, that they're not exactly perfect because there's a bit of a human element, a human error there. And then competency-based education uses these written competency statements, and it's a whole educational system that says when a trainer or when a trainee, a learner, has achieved these competencies, they're done. So rather than reaching an hour benchmark, so you've achieved 1,500 hours or 50 hours doing this, that once you can demonstrate these knowledge, skills, and attitudes, then you're finished training. So that's where you get the customization, that's where you get the opportunity for efficiencies, moving through training more quickly, and you can see as well that it can be more real-world oriented. So one of the real goals of competency-based training is, I think everyone's probably experienced this as well, where you've if you could allow me. So I would ask you in a minute to raise your hand if you've ever sat in a classroom or an educational session, and then at the end of that session thought to yourself, that has no relevance to my job. Does that ever happen? Yeah, and so you guys have probably all heard the expression of people say, after you're done school and you go to work, and they say, okay, now forget everything you learned in the classroom, I'm going to teach you how it's really done. now, that everybody knows there's a bit of a gap between teaching and the real world. Competency-based training tries to eliminate that gap. So we try to really teach people the skills that they need to do the job. Another example I always give is you think about basic pilot training, that we teach somebody air law and then navigation and then systems, and these are sort of separately, and then we test them on them separately. But if you think about what a pilot's job really is, no pilot is in an aircraft and they're thinking, okay, now I'm going to think about weather exclusively, then I'm going to stop thinking about weather, and now I'm going to think about air law. Like but they're not separate in the real world. And so you say, well, why do we teach them separately? Because it's easier to teach them that way. It's not because it's better. And a lot of the research actually shows the more segregated content is when you're learning it, the longer it takes a person to put it back together again in the real world. So it sort of should cause you to stop and think that a lot of people push back against competency-based training because they say, like, we have a good system and it works and it's safe, and it absolutely does, and it does work and it is safe. But the reality is that the global training capacity is not going to meet the projected demand. And so we need to think about, in addition to the way we've always done things, thinking about whether there are opportunities to do things in different ways as well. So I like to also talk about sort of just the idea that competency-based teaching should be good teaching. So a lot of the time, nobody here, but like at other places and other schools, you may have heard the term death by PowerPoint. And it's like where they put up there's a deck of 300 PowerPoint slides and you just have to sort of listen to them all. And that's actually one of the least effective ways to learn. That if you look at retention rates from a lecture, unfortunately I'm lecturing right now, but retention rates from a lecture are only about 5% at best. That in order to have higher retention rates, people need to be engaged with problems. They need to think critically. The problems they're working on need to matter and feel real. And they need to be emotionally connected to the problems that they're solving. And so this boring death by PowerPoint is not a good way to teach. It's bad teaching. So again, one of the other sort of lessons I sort of would pass along with what competencies can teach us is that we don't have to throw away what we're already doing. We can learn some lessons from competency-based education just about how to make teaching more effective and more engaging. So I really like this quote on the slide. So people learn best by confronting intriguing, beautiful, or important problems, authentic tasks that challenge them to grapple with ideas, rethink their assumptions, and examine their mental models. I'm not going to read the rest, but I just want to think about, in your own experiences with educational environments, how often are you challenged? How often are you intrigued and you're sort of engaged with what you're doing? And how often are you just waiting at the clock and waiting for it to be over? So I think overall, if we can think about moving our teaching practices towards more of some of the lessons that we use in competencies, and you can see some of them are outlined in the graph there, but it just is all about authentic, interactive, whole task training as much as possible. So overall, just a few grains for thought. So I talked about the international pilot supply, some of the growth projected on an international scale. I know that from a pilot supply issue, many people who have been in the industry for a longer period of time know that the industry is cyclical. And we say, yeah, we need a lot of pilots now, but it's going to go up and down because it always has in the past. But I think the reality of today is that this growth is driven primarily by large-scale socioeconomic issues in the Asia-Pacific region. So we're talking about millions and millions of more people in an emerging middle class who are able to afford air travel for the first time. So I'm sure we will always have a cyclical industry, but this kind of growth isn't something that can just evaporate overnight. So I talked a little bit about competencies. Again, it's a much bigger issue, but hopefully I gave you a little insight that can give you a little bit of an idea of what it is. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Suzanne. So our next presenter is Teresa Davis Woodhouse. She's Director of Project Management for the Canadian Council of Aviation and Aerospace, CCAA. Teresa joined CCAA in January 2005, and she's currently the Director of Project Management. Teresa has extensive experience working on a number of data collection studies and has just completed one of the most detailed labor market information studies ever undertaken for aviation and aerospace. It was funded by the federal government and it is truly a comprehensive look at the industry. It encompassed all sectors and provides needed data on projected labor and skill shortages. Teresa also oversees CCAA audits and accreditation, youth outreach, including their high school curriculum for aircraft maintenance, and the CCAA partnership with the Air Cadet League of Canada. Teresa.
Hello, thanks for being here and listening to this panel. We really appreciate your time. So I'm with the Canadian Council for Aviation and Aerospace, and a good portion of our projects, including this LMI project that we're going to be speaking about, is funded by the Government of Canada. These are the numbers from 2016, so they've probably changed a bit since then, but I think what I really want everyone to take away from the numbers is the ratios and the intent, and that we have some issues and we have a lot of people retiring, and if the numbers are off by 500 here or 1,000 here, that's irrelevant. It's what it means to us in terms of labor supply. So the industry employed an estimated 154,000 workers across Canada in 2016. These are direct jobs only. So we know that there is much more indirect employment than that. Air transport alone accounted for 44% of the employment, aerospace manufacturing 34%, and support activities at 22%. This is the regional distribution of the employment across Canada, but we know that the business aviation, whether it's aviation operations or manufacturing of business aircraft, their employment is largest in Quebec at about 11,000, followed by Ontario at about 5,500, Alberta at 26, and British Columbia at 23. That's the distribution for business aviation. From an educational point of view, we have a more highly skilled workforce than the average Canadian industry. And we have a 72% average have post-secondary education. So it is a very highly skilled industry that requires some educational background. Gender distribution, so we spoke about this earlier. 70% of the industry is male. And then the critical occupations that we're having shortages, it's under 10% are female. So this is an issue, of course, and it's an issue across a lot of industries, but it's really prevalent in ours. Age distribution. Our industry is slightly older than the average Canadian workforce, but I think what's interesting is we have half as many workers under 25 as the rest of the industries across Canada. And so we don't have as many youth coming up into the industry right now. Indigenous people across Canada, it's our most under-leveraged human resources asset, and in the industry, in all industries across Canada, it's about 4%, and in our industry, it's 3%. So it's not that different, but it's definitely an underused resource. Immigration status, we are about the same as the rest of Canada. So here, I'm just giving you the highlights of the report because the report itself is actually about 100 pages. Okay, so we're just sticking to the highlights on this. Hiring requirements. So this is where it gets interesting. We need to hire about 55,000 workers before 2025 across all three subsectors. For aerospace manufacturing alone, by 2025, we need to hire 12,000 workers. 78% of the hiring requirements in aerospace manufacturing, this comes from replacement demand. So quite a good portion of the hiring requirements in all of the industries that I'm speaking about are replacement demand. We have about 3,200 new entrants that are projected supply over a 9-year period, and that's just 17% of the requirements in manufacturing. And support activities for air transportation, which includes our maintenance guys, 75% of the hiring requirements are replacement demand. About 3,900 workers are projected to enter the industry, which leaves us 8,200 workers needed from where? From other industries, from other jurisdictions. And air transport, 72% of the hiring requirements are replacement demand. And with a projected entrance of about 6,900, we're still going to need almost 18,000 from other jurisdictions or other industries. So they're critical numbers. Occupations most in demand, we know. So again, most of this data, I think anecdotally, we all knew this and we've all talked about it, but it's good to have it on paper where you can actually take it to local governments and make plans based on the data. Aircraft pilots, flight engineers, and flight instructors all fall into the one category, and we need about 7,300 of these by 2025. Aircraft mechanics is next, and then there's a whole slew of other ones. And it should be noted that in the aircraft maintenance and manufacturing industries, there's a lot of occupations where we're having shortages, but they're not big numbers, actually. They're small numbers, but they're critical to the organization. So they might need a non-destructive tester level 3. They're hard to find, but they need one of them, or they need to share one with another company. So things like composite workers and non-destructive testers, painters, there's not exactly a lot of training out there, and the numbers are very small. It's hard to get a college program going for numbers that aren't sustainable in the training. Critical shortages, obviously, pilots. So we need about 7,300 new pilots and flight instructors by 2025. We issue less than 1,200 new commercial pilot licenses each year, and about 45% of these are going to foreign students. And out of all of those numbers, only about 70% go to work in the industry anyways. So we have a shortage of close to at least 3,000 pilots by 2025, and we only have 7% female participation in this occupation. For maintenance workers, 5,300 new ones need it. We only graduate about 600 a year that aren't foreign students, so Canadian students, about 600 in the aircraft maintenance technician category. Approximately 77% of these go to work in the industry, and we're going to have a shortage of at least 1,200 of these, and 6% female participation in aircraft maintenance technicians. Pilot fatigue rules, I think there was a panel on it, or there's some discussion on it. I'm not an expert on that whatsoever, but I do know that if those rules go into effect, it's going to be another 26% increase in what is needed before 2025, and that makes the total go up from 7,300 to about 9,800 pilots needed. One thing about our industry is we're lucky in that we have some education that is dedicated to our industry. So it's pilot training, it's maintenance, avionics, structures, gas turbine, it's engineers. We have specific industry training that we really need to make sure that we either are increasing or tapping into those students, making sure they stay in the industry. And as far as outreach goes, we've spoken a little bit about that. We actually have the ears of the air cadets, which is, I forget what the numbers are now, but it's 25,000 or something across Canada, I forget, all ready to be brought into the industry or have it already pre-liking of the industry and a knowledge of the industry that we could tap into. So from just specific for maintenance, avionics, structures, gas turbine, those kind of technical skills, we graduate only about 1,500 a year, and only about 77% of those stay in the industry. In fact, we've had classes totally wiped out, I've heard. One of the schools, I think it was BCIT, a couple of years ago, their avionics class graduated, and almost 100% of that class got snapped up by another industry because they're very talented, well-trained technicians. Aerospace engineering, we only graduate about 300 a year in aerospace engineering. Flight training, we've all talked about this already, so we're putting out less than 1,200 commercial pilot licenses per year, and there was a drop for a couple of years where it was quite lower than that. And so overall findings, looming retirements, our replacement rates are higher than our growth rates for sure. And companies need to have a balance. So just getting new people into the workforce isn't really even enough. You have to get some new people in there that are experienced. You have to have a balance between your experienced workers and your new workers to be effective. And you have to have knowledge transfer from those older workers as they're leaving so that the new workers understand all the finer points of the business. We're having difficulty finding enough workers with the right experience and the right skill sets. So they're not all coming out of school ready to work. There's some skill sets that are missing, which is typical, but we seem to be feeling that more as an industry. Business models have changed. Workers need to have more diverse skill sets. So this is specific in manufacturing and maintenance, maybe more than pilots, I'm not sure. But for maintenance and manufacturing, absolutely. The skill sets and models, business models have changed, and they need different training. Soft skills and business skills lacking on practically, I think, every occupation. I think this is a generational issue. Specifically, we've heard critical thinking, ability to make decisions on your own, troubleshooting, security clearance, I think specifically for pilots too as well, has been an issue. And again, occupational shortages are not always large numbers, but they're critical things for a company like the non-destructive testing. We're becoming more digital. I've heard that planes are becoming one great big iPad. I've heard that from a lot of companies, that their planes are becoming, so the avionics is changing completely. And our training isn't keeping up with the emerging skill sets required. Our schools don't have access to the newest equipment, the latest equipment, proprietary equipment, and required training isn't even available in our region. So we're seeing a shortage of aerospace engineers in British Columbia. We don't train aerospace engineers in British Columbia. So, hey, we don't train composites in every region. We don't train painters practically anywhere. And structures used to be popular, and now all the training's dropped off for structures. KF Aerospace just worked with their local college to get some structures training put back in. Some training isn't available at all. Technical writing training, stores training. I've heard we have engineers going into companies without practical hands-on experience. So that's been an issue for a lot of companies, that they don't have that practical hands-on experience when they go in, that work integrated learning. Same with our technicians and our mechanics, especially in a generation now where people don't work on their cars in the backyard anymore or in their laneway, and they don't fix their radios. Everything gets thrown out. And so we have a generation of students not having those same kind of hands-on skills going into college and going into high school and college. Manufacturers need to integrate lead processes to remain competitive, and companies need to increase or upskill. When companies need to increase or upskill their workforce, it puts a huge strain on the rest of the company and their HR departments. We always think of it as just a hiring challenge, but it's actually a challenge for them to fit in, for them to get trained up, for all the human resources people, all the human resources that go with it. It's a strain on the entire company. And last, again, industry is not tapping into our underrepresented workforce, women and Indigenous workers. And we have a lot of issues, I think, as well with generational differences, but that would be a whole new panel. So we won't talk about that. So part of this survey that CCAA did, the stats that you just saw were mostly from the National Labour Force surveys and Stats Canada surveys. But we also went out and interviewed a ton of companies and spoke with a lot of workers and a lot of employers. The first survey that was completed in 2016 tapped into, I think, a number of the employers represented 52,000 workers, and then one in 2017 it represented 39,000 workers, half of them actually air transport. So what are the couple of things we learned? And I'm just sticking to the two occupations because I think they're the most critical and resonate most with us in this room, is your maintenance technicians. So our AMEs are not getting enough hands-on experience. We can't find those AMEs with that 5 years experience. Like, everyone could maybe find one or two new AMEs, but you can't find those with a few years experience, that middle ground of people. Our avionics systems are completely changing. Structures are hard to find and nobody's training them. We can find welders, but I've heard we can't find an actual good welder with the actual techniques needed in the aerospace market. Machinists are a shortage. Composites a shortage, NDT, electrics, painters, carpenters, landing gear assembly. So there's a few that are top critical shortages. And of course, pilots, some of the specialties, enough hours, customer service skills, which I think is really important in your industry, business aviation. Your pilots have to have more customer service skills, I am imagining, than the regular pilot in a larger airline. You're dealing more hands-on with the client. So they actually have to have more leadership skills, conflict resolution skills, business skills, and also airworthiness inspectors are hard to find these days in the flight operations departments. We have a couple projects that we're working with other sectors of the industry to work on labor market shortages, and we're developing a labor market roadmap with the input of industry. We're certainly not doing it on our own, but we're just facilitating industry to do so. We've had 2 labor market information days, and we have another one coming up in October at the Museum in Ottawa. And what we don't have is a lot of representation from business aviation, and we would love to have a couple dedicated people on that, and we can talk about that later. But we also have a student work integrated learning program, and so this is funding for employers who are hiring students to get work integrated learning in their companies. They have to be in an aviation, aerospace type program, a STEM program, actually. So it could be an aircraft maintenance tech, or it could be an engineer, it could be I don't know, schedulers or things like that. We've had at some of the airports. And so if they're in a STEM program or a business program, they're qualified for this funding. They come to you, they do a work integrated learning, whether it's an internship or a co-op, and you can get up from $5,000 to $7,000 back on their wages. So if you want more information on that, you can ask. And part of that project is we're also working with a consortium of companies led by some of the airlines, including Air Canada, Air Georgia, and Jazz, to do a multidisciplinary technician curriculum. And this is a combining of 3 trades. So this is where we need a different skill set for some of our workers and and not all the airlines feel that way, and not all the flight operators feel that way. But some of the larger ones feel that they need their workers to have more skill sets than just your regular maintenance avionics structures. That they want somebody with a multidisciplinary skill set that's actually maintenance, avionics, and interiors in most places. And so we're working with these companies and some dedicated colleges to see if we can develop, and I mean, it's not an easy road because it's regulatory, it's audited by Transport Canada, these type of curriculums, not just us. And the schools have to change their pace of how they teach things, of when they teach things. We're looking at trying to develop a program that's 4 years instead of 2 years, but half of the time would be spent in work integrated learning in a company. So the student would go to school for 6 months, learn enough to be useful in your organization when they get there, do 6 months of work integrated learning, 6 months in school, back and forth. And this is a little bit more on our National Labor Market Strategy Day. So our next one is held on October 3rd. It'll be our 3rd. And so from that, we have developed some working groups and subcommittees who are working on some key things in the industry, including outreach, which we all realize is important to get the outreach going to youth and to make them understand what the career paths are. I think a lot of the youth don't understand where they can go in the industry, how they can move up the ladder, or how they can move from occupation to occupation. And so we're trying to develop some of these career paths, and they'll be available to whoever wants them so that schools can use those as well. Female participation, Indigenous participation. We are working with the ATAC committee that was spoke of earlier, and this committee is looking at the pilot shortage issue, and we have we've put in funding for a new labor market information project, and if that comes through, which we're hoping for in September, we'll have some funding to work with that committee and actually be able to facilitate some working groups and hire a facilitator, a subject matter expert who knows things about the female participation rate in pilots to come up with new ways to recruit, to find out what the roadblocks are, and to actually maybe even speak to some of the students and actually get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Speak to the students and find out why the women aren't going into these occupations. And let's get it from them. Let's talk to them. So we want to hold focus groups on this. This is just a bit more on the student work integrated learning program. So we have enough funding to place 1,000 students over 4 years, and we've only placed 300 at this point, so which is on goal for us. But we have a lot more funding, and it's 2.5 years. So if your company is looking to hire somebody in work integrated learning, co-op, or internship, take advantage of the funding. So the one last thing I want to mention is through ATAC, we are trying to develop a modification for this student work integrated learning program, the SWIP program, because right now it doesn't work for pilots. All right, so, and we realize that, and that was never the intent of the program, I think, from the government to have it work necessarily for the pilot industry, but excuse me, we realize there's a real need for that, and we want to be able to try and modify the program to work for pilots. So we've been working with ATAC, and they've developed a concept paper, a modification on the SWIP program that would make funding available to aviation students wanting to complete an instructor rating or a float rating. So it wouldn't solve all our issues, but it would be a start, and it would allow some funding to become available through that program for pilots and not just for the technician positions or the engineering positions. And so we have got a final document, and we are going to be meeting with the SDC to see if they could move forward on changing the SWIP program to include pilots over the next 2.5 years. Thank you very much.